The world had grown small for the British Empire, hemmed in by the wreckage of Dunkirk and the shadow of a continent lost to darkness. Yet, in the scorched vastness of North Africa, a new, brutal theater emerged. Here, the land itself was an enemy more formidable than any army. Imagine a horizon that offers no mercy, a searing, endless expanse of dunes where the sun strips the skin and the wind carries the stinging grit of pulverized rock. It is a place of primal silence, broken only by the rhythmic, grinding groan of tank tracks and the distant, haunting whine of engines struggling against the heat. Here, glory is a ghost. In this crucible, the measure of a man was not found in medals or imperial ambition, but in the cold arithmetic of logistics. Water, fuel, ammunition, these were the true currencies of survival. For the British, the Suez Canal was a lifeline, a vital artery that had to be held at any cost, for if it slipped away, the Mediterranean would become a closed sea, and the war, in its most desperate hour, might well be lost. The desert did not care for bravery. It demanded endurance. It required an army to fight not just against a cunning foe, but against the suffocating, relentless indifference of the sand itself.
Across this scorched and shifting canvas, a new, volatile energy began to stir. Into the heart of the dust-choked expanse came Erwin Rommel, a man who saw the desert not as a graveyard for ambition, but as a stage for his own distinct brand of kinetic warfare. While the Allied commanders clung to the rigidity of static defense, paralyzed by the cautious weight of tradition, Rommel embraced the chaos with a rallying cry that echoed over the dunes, Heya Safari. As the grainy, sepia-toned footage flickers to life, we see them, the Panzers, silhouettes of iron and grit, tearing through the haze with a speed that defied the heavy, suffocating air. He did not engage in the traditional, methodical duels of armor against armor. Instead, he employed the 88mm anti-tank gun not as a mere piece of artillery, but as a lethal, stationary vanguard, waiting to tear through steel before his tanks even closed the distance to mop up the broken remains of the infantry. It was a masterclass in audacity that left his adversaries reeling, blinded by their own hesitation. If these echoes of the past resonate with you, consider subscribing to join our journey as we continue to unearth the stories that shaped our world. In this theater of war, where the heat distortion made friend and foe indistinguishable in the distance, Rommel's speed was his greatest weapon, turning the vast, indifferent desert into an arena where only the bold would survive the turning tide of history. Across the vast, shifting expanse of the Cyrenaican desert, a deceptive calm settles over the land, stretching like a fragile necklace from the coastal bastion of Gazala to the remote, sun-bleached ruins of Bir Hakeim. The Allied line appears imposing on the paper maps of command. Yet in the searing, crucible heat of May 1942, this is nothing more than a static mirage. Watch as the digital topography shifts, revealing the hollow truth. These are not a unified wall of iron, but isolated, shivering strongpoints, pockets of men separated by miles of unforgiving scrub and emptiness.
The sound of the desert here is the rhythmic, metallic scrape of shovels biting into rock-hard earth, a futile clawing at a ground that refuses to offer shelter. Thousands of soldiers, drenched in sweat and grit, bury themselves in the limestone, nurturing an illusion of security behind belts of barbed wire and buried mines. They wait, bolstered by the false comfort of their numbers, unaware that they are building a cage rather than a shield. While the Eighth Army watches the horizon for a conventional blow, Rommel's operational intent is already coalescing in the blind spots, a shadow moving with fluid, predatory grace. He does not fear their disconnected fortifications. He views them as an invitation, a brittle structure waiting to be shattered by the very speed they cannot fathom, turning the desert into a graveyard for the stationary.
The silence of the Libyan desert was not a void, but a breath held before the scream. Under the shroud of a moonless night, the static, brittle line of the Allies began to tremble. This was Operation Venezia, a masterpiece of deception designed to turn the terrain itself into a weapon. As the desert cooled, dragging the heat of the day deep into the sand, the stillness was broken by a rhythmic, unnatural thrumming. Axis trucks laden with heavy, dismounted aircraft engines churned across the hard-packed crust. They were not transporting supplies. They were conjuring ghosts. Behind them, massive, artificial plumes of dust rose like tidal waves, swallowing the horizon and blinding any observer to the true predatory intent of the main strike force, maneuvering to the south. Inside the Allied command centers, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the frantic scratching of grease pencils against celluloid map overlays. Officers squinted onto the harsh flicker of dim bulbs, their fingers tracing the shifting front lines. But the arrows they drew were chasing mirages. Confusion, sharp and jagged, began to take hold as reports contradicted one another, whispered across crackling radio wires like fragmented prayers. They stared at the symbols on their maps, paralyzed by a mounting, gnawing doubt. Was the dust to the north a feint, or the herald of their annihilation? In the darkness, Rommel's columns surged forward, moving with the cold, deliberate precision of a clockwork heartbeat, leaving the command-driven chaos of the Eighth Army to choke on the very clouds of sand they themselves had raised. Silence descended upon the desert floor, a deceptive, heavy stillness that hung over the depression known as the Cauldron. Within the Allied command, time seemed to stretch, caught in the amber of bureaucratic hesitation. While the Eighth Army commanders peered through their binoculars, convinced they held the desert fox in a tightening grip, they mistook their own inactivity for mastery. It is a peculiar tragedy of warfare to possess the hounds, yet believe the wolf is already vanquished and thus refuse to let the chase conclude. The Allied camp sat in a stifling, slow-motion tension, officers tracing lines on maps that no longer matched the shifting reality of the dunes. They saw a trap that had failed,
and in their paws they gifted the enemy the one commodity they could never afford to yield: time. For Rommel, the respite was a feverish miracle of iron and sweat. While the British dithered, the Axis forces were a blur of frantic, disciplined labour. Through the searing heat, over the grit and pulverized limestone, Rommel's logistics teams carved new paths through their own minefields, dragging supply lines into the very heart of the conflict with an audacity that defied conventional doctrine. The fox was not trapped. He was simply sharpening his teeth. History is often written in the gaps between decision and action. In those quiet, echoing moments where the fate of thousands hangs on a single missed opportunity. If these echoes of the past resonate with you, if you feel the weight of those silent, fateful hours, consider subscribing to join our journey. Together, we can continue to unearth the stories that lie beneath the shifting sands of time. For in understanding the hesitations of the past, we illuminate the path of our present.
To truly grasp the cost of such ambition, we must turn our gaze to the sun-scorched earth of Bir Hakeim. Here, the horizon is not merely a line where sand meets sky. It is a canvas of swirling, suffocating dust, churned into a grey-brown shroud by the relentless tread of Panzer tracks. The air is thick with the copper tang of cordite and the dry, parching heat of a furnace. Within the crumbling, jagged remnants of the fortress, the Free French forces, along with the grit-hardened veterans of the Foreign Legion, faced an abyss that seemed to swallow all hope. They were ghosts of a lost cause, hunkered down in shallow trenches as the sky above turned into a tempest of steel. Stuka dive bombers screamed down, their sirens wailing like banshees of the desert, while the ground trembled under the weight of an overwhelming Axis armor assault, a relentless pounding that turned stone to powder and bone to ash. Every breath was a struggle against grit that coated the throat and burned the lungs. Yet in this suffocating isolation, the resistance held. It was a desperate, primal defiance, a refusal to be extinguished by the sheer velocity of Rommel's machinery. But even the strongest iron must eventually bend. As the southern flank began to fracture under the unrelenting pressure, the fortress became a claustrophobic tomb, the perimeter shrinking with every blast, the spirit of the defenders straining against the inevitable collapse of their hard-fought sanctuary. The collapse, once a whisper of doubt on the horizon, arrived with the roar of a furnace. At the fortress of Tobruk, the air grew thick with the acrid, black bloom of burning fuel dumps. A colossal funeral pyre for the Eighth Army's hope, casting a hellish, flickering shadow over the desert floor. The relentless heat of the Libyan summer was now eclipsed by the stifling temperature of ruin. As columns of smoke choked the sky, and the ground trembled under the weight of a sudden, desperate retreat. Men who had held their ground against the tides of war now found themselves navigating a labyrinth of chaos, where the boundaries between order and oblivion had dissolved into sand and shattered steel. The pride of the Commonwealth, a garrison that had stood as a beacon of defiance, was swiftly dismantled. In the closing hours, silence returned to the perimeter. But it was not the silence of victory. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a catastrophe.
33,000 men, a generation of soldiers, laid down their arms in the largest British capitulation since the fall of Singapore. They stood amidst the debris of their own ambition, watching as the desert fox claimed the prize that had eluded him for so long. The port, once a strategic bastion, became a graveyard of logistics, surrendering not just its walls, but the very momentum of the campaign into the hands of an adversary who had masterfully turned audacity into an art form. The desert, indifferent to the cost, merely shifted its sands over the scars of the defeat, marking the end of a chapter written in blood, fire, and the bitter ink of failure.
For Erwin Rommel, the triumph at Gazala was more than a victory. It was a metamorphosis. In the sweltering heat of the Libyan summer, the desert fox stood at the zenith of his legend, bathed in the accolades of a German high command that saw in him the embodiment of modern war. Promoted to field marshal, he was a man transformed, his gaze now fixed hungrily on the verdant prize of the Nile Delta, unaware that he was walking into a trap set not by men, but by distance itself. For beneath the veneer of his rapid, dust-choked advances, the reality of the desert was biting back. Every kilometer he gained, his supply line stretched like a frayed wire, gasping for fuel, ammunition, and the very lifeblood of a mechanized army. The smell of victory, a sharp, metallic cocktail of scorching oil and cordite, began to mingle with the bitter scent of overextension. The tide, though seemingly rushing in his favor, had already begun its inexorable retreat. Into this furnace of exhaustion and fading momentum arrived a man of cold, clinical precision, Bernard Montgomery. He brought with him a new rhythm, a methodical orchestration of infantry and steel that replaced the chaotic improvisation of the past. As the two forces collided at the threshold of El Alamein, the age of the gambler was drawing to a close, and the age of the grinder had begun. Here, amidst the indifferent silence of the dunes, the desert prepared to decide the fate of empires, one hard-won yard at a time.
The momentum, once held by the shadow of the swastika, began to shatter against the sheer, relentless industrial might of a world awakened. From the west, a new tide surged, a mechanized avalanche of steel and purpose that folded the map of North Africa upon itself, squeezing the Axis forces between the hammer of the Eighth Army and the anvil of new incoming Allied fronts. The desert, which had for years been a crucible of brilliant improvisation and daring feints, finally grew weary of the gamble. As the sun set on the final desperate positions in Tunisia, the air grew thick with the acrid scent of burning diesel and the hollow, metallic groans of abandoned panzers cooling in the cooling night air. Rommel, the desert fox, was now a ghost of his former self, his health failing, his legend eclipsed by the simple, brutal arithmetic of a war he could no longer outrun. In the final shivering light of his departure, the dream of an African empire dissolved into the shifting sands. This was not merely the loss of territory. It was the collapse of a central Axis pillar, marking a definitive, irreversible shift in the global balance of power. If these echoes of the past resonate with you, consider subscribing to join our journey. Your support allows us to continue unearthing the profound lessons written into the very earth of our collective history. As the dust settled over the silence of the dunes, one thing became clear. The age of the gambler had officially died, and the cold, mechanical reality of the future had finally, irrevocably arrived.